They say the worst bargains aren't made with money, but with hope. And if you've ever stood in a dusty auction yard while a horse looks at you like it's remembering a better world, you know exactly what I mean. Before we step into the day, I raised my hand for a horse nobody wanted and found out why miracles pick the strangest addresses. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story brushes anything tender inside your chest, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the animal everyone gives up on becomes the reason a whole town starts believing again. The county auction was the kind of place that smells like hay and regret, sun hammering off the tin roof, loudspeakers popping, numbers and lives moving faster than sense, ranchers with folded arms, horse traders in caps that said they don't lose money, a few families in Saturday clothes pretending this is a field trip and not a pit stop between heartbreaks. Lot 47 came out limping just enough to make cautious men check their boots, a tall gray with a hip bone like a handle, and a patch of white on his forehead, shaped like a thumbprint pressed by an impatient god. The catalog called him grade gelding, unknown age, hard to catch, which is auction speak for someone else's problem. He wore a rope halter too tight, and the kind of look animals get when the future has been canceled and nobody told the body yet. The bidding started at 50 and slid downhill. The man in the straw hat behind me muttered that the killer buyers would scoop him for meat weight if the price dropped any further. I didn't come to buy a horse. Came for cheap panels and a used mineral feeder. Practical things for a small place that survived by lists and glue. But the gray lifted his head and found me in that noisy room, with the kind of eye that doesn't accuse or ask, just meets you where you're standing, and I recognized something I don't advertise, the quiet between panic and giving up. "Sold," the ringman shouted. But the buyer's hand had second thoughts, some confusion about a number, and the auctioneer barked for clarity with irritation slick as oil. I raised my hand the way you touch a hot stove, knowing better. 100, I said, and a few heads turned to see the idiot who just bought a limp. "You own him," the man in the hat said, and I thought that was probably the only time in our friendship he'd use the word own like a warning. We loaded him with the caution you bring to strangers and bad knees, and he followed the lead line like it was a decision he'd already made. He didn't pull, didn't balk, didn't perform. He just stepped into the stock trailer with that tired grace horses have when they've been disappointed and are willing to try one more morning anyway. My place isn't big, but it is stubborn. 30 acres of fence that knows my name, a barn that leans when weather gets personal, and a house that keeps the coffee hot even when the heater shivers. I put the gray in the south paddock where the ground is kind and the view is honest. He didn't run the fence. He didn't call to neighbors. He grazed like a monk and watched the wind. When I went in with a brush, he flinched 3 times at nothing and 1 time at everything. Fast hands, the memory of a thrown lead rope, the echo of a gate slammed too close to a face. I worked slow, from shoulder to rump, humming that off-key 2-note song my mother used to hum at sink scrubbing time, and he let his eyelid drop half an inch as if daylight had gone on sale. At dusk I sat on the fence rail and said out loud the thing I hadn't told anyone, that last winter nearly broke me, that the numbers on the ledger don't care how hard you pray, that I had started to believe my best work was behind me. The gray flicked an ear, then another, like a switchboard operator connecting the line. "You need a name," I told him. The white thumbprint on his forehead caught the last light, shaped itself into something almost like a comma, and I said Miles, because sometimes distance is what it took to get here. He had a lot of stories written on him in scars and hesitations, a rope burn answering a question nobody asked, a saddle rub that says someone cinched fast and rode faster, a nick on the cannon bone with grease and dirt, caked in a way that means cheap medicine and cheaper time. But his mind was a cathedral, big, quiet, full of places where the echo changes if you stand in the right spot. In the mornings, I brought mash and a promise, and he learned that my hands don't come in from above. They circle, they warn, they offer. In the afternoons, he learned gates open in both directions, and nobody chases you through them. In the evenings, he learned voices drop low when the day gets brittle, and you can put your nose in a man's chest without being taught not to. I posted his photo online with the phrase "everybody hates to type." Free to good home, sound with maintenance, needs patient handler, and discovered how creative people can be when they're auditioning for something they don't plan to keep. One woman wanted him for her boyfriend's birthday surprise. One man said his little girl needed a starter horse that won't cost much or complain. A trainer I used to admire offered to take him for rehoming if I paid a month's board up front. Friends told me I'd bought myself a project and a reminder. "Unload him quick," one said kindly, "before you fall in love." As if falling in love wasn't the only reason any of this ever works. The first bad day surprised me because it was beautiful. Blue sky like a promise, breeze exactly right. Pastures green as if God had a go at it last night. A county school bus pulled over by the east fence so the driver could take a picture of the wildflowers on her brake, and the click of the folding door echoed across the field like a clap. Miles went rigid. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just gone, eyes turned to polished stone. He moved into a trot without asking, hit a lope like a whisper, and ran the perimeter like he was reading a map he didn't want to remember. I stood at the gate with the halter and did the only trick I trust. I got smaller. Sat down in the grass. Looked away. Talked about nothing. His circle tightened. He blew once. The kind of blow horses make when they realize nobody's trying to kill them at this particular second, and came to a walk with head low. He put the rook of his forehead. No, not a rook this time. The white patch had a way of changing its mind in the light. Thumbprint again. Against my palm, and leaned his weight like a tired man leaning against a bar where nobody asks questions. "There you are," I told him, which was as much for me as for him. The bus door clattered shut, and the field went quiet. He didn't run again after that, not like that, not for noise. He saved the rest of his speed for something else. The second bad day wasn't about Miles at all. It was about a boy named Theo, who lived across the way in the clapboard house with the basketball hoop that leans, and the porch swing that complains. Theo is 12 and made entirely of elbows and intention. He rides a rusted blue bike and tells the truth like he invented it. He and Miles invented a game at the fence line where Theo would walk. Miles would walk, Theo would stop. Miles would stop, Theo would bow. Miles would make that snorting half-laugh noise like a man who forgot how jokes work. One late afternoon, a dog in the next pasture chased a rabbit through a gap, and the rabbit made the mistake rabbits make. It chose speed instead of brains, and bolted straight for the road. Theo's bike followed the rabbit because 12-year-old math says momentum is a plan. And a pickup with more rust than brakes came over the rise doing 60 and a little. Music up, situational awareness down. I saw it before Theo did, and I hollered with the kind of voice that splits air. He yanked his handlebars at the last second too hard, jammed the front wheel into the ditch culvert, and flipped end over backwards onto the gravel. There's a silence that comes right after the ugly noises when everyone present is negotiating with whatever they believe in. That silence was broken by the squeal of the truck as it fishtailed to a stop, and by a sound I'd never heard from Miles. A deep, chest-born roar that wasn't a whinny, wasn't a neigh, wasn't anything you'd sell at a petting zoo. The gray launched, over the fence like a deer, tail flagged, legs finding places that would have shrugged me off. He ate the ground between Theo and the truck like it owed him money, put his whole body between boy and bumper, and stood as if he could be a wall if asked. The driver spilled out apologies and shock and smelling like a decision he'd regret. And I was there with my phone and the sheriff on speed dial, and my hand shaking in that specific way. Fathers' hands shake even if they're not the father in question. Theo breathed and then cried and then breathed again. And I sat in the gravel and told my heart to stop acting like it was unfamiliar with the job. The paramedics came and pronounced him bruised, scraped, and intact, which is pronouncement enough to rebaptize a man. Miles stood with his nostrils on Theo's hair, blowing softly like he was counting. News runs faster than water downhill. By supper, 3 neighbors knew I owned a unicorn. By breakfast, 7 wanted to borrow him for a parade. I laughed because absurd is the body's way of forgiving adrenaline. The truth is simpler and more serious. The horse nobody wanted had planted himself in front of the worst moment of a boy's year and refused to move. People ask me afterward if that kind of thing can be trained. It can and it can't. You can teach a horse to pick you, but he has to want to pick someone first. Requests came in bunches after that. Could Theo come bring carrots? Yes. Could the third graders come meet a real horse for their animal unit? Sure, but fingers flat and we talk about boundaries. Could the church youth group do photos for their kindness campaign? Yes, if kindness is more than photos. Could we maybe consider letting Miles visit the therapy center on Wednesdays, where kids with attention that runs too fast learn to slow it down to the speed of hooves? I didn't plan to start a program. I planned to keep a promise to a horse, but promises to animals multiply like time does when you stop counting minutes and start counting moments. Wednesday afternoons became a ritual. The first week, a kid named Harper, who hadn't spoken to her occupational therapist in 3 sessions, told Miles he had nice eyelashes, and the therapist said nothing and later cried in the hallway. The second week, a veteran with a jaw clenched tighter than his fists let a wet gray muzzle rest against his shoulder and remembered how to breathe all the way to the bottom. The third week, Theo came with his scraped knees now scabbed and his mother carrying a gratitude she didn't know where to put. And he walked Miles in slow laps and told him a story about a science fair volcano that had embarrassed him into inventing a new kind of courage. I stood in the corner and tried to look unnecessary. Not every day was a headline. Some days were mud and flies and stubborn. Miles stepped on my toe and I said a word the youth group didn't need in their vocabulary. He colicked once and we danced the midnight walk, me cursing whatever God forgets to distribute luck evenly. Him looking at me like I was an idiot for arguing with a gut. He spooked at a blue tarp one morning, and I made a blue tarp his new religion until he stopped. I spooked at a bank notice, and he made the present my new religion until I remembered there are more ways to be poor than the kind with numbers. The man in the straw hat came by to lean on the fence and say I'd gotten lucky. I told him luck had very little to do with not treating a living thing like a receipt. The miracle didn't arrive with trumpets. It showed up on a Wednesday at 4:17 p.m., when Harper, she of the eyelashes observation, hopped down from the mounting block, slid both small hands along Miles's neck and said, clear enough to echo, I'm not scared anymore. The room stilled the way churches do when the hymn hits the exact note the rafters were cut to hold. Her mother covered her mouth with both hands and made a sound I've only heard twice. Once when someone learns there's more time than the doctor predicted, and once when a person you thought would never come back does. You can call that progress if you want. I call it heat in a room that had gotten cold. I call it a horse nobody wanted carrying the rest of us across something we couldn't have walked alone. People ask me now, at the feed store and after church and in line at the diner, if I'll ever sell Miles. They say it politely, like asking whether I'll ever sell my truck, or the antique hand-crank corn sheller that doesn't shell anything anymore, but looks pretty good doing it. I tell them I didn't buy him for $100. I bought him for 100 chances. I tell them ownership is a legal term and family is not. They nod and pretend they understand. And then they bring carrots, the good kind. If you're still here, and if you are, tell me where you're watching from because I like knowing which winds carry these words. Know this, the world's best investments rarely show up on paper. Sometimes they limp into an auction ring with a halter too tight and a history nobody bothered to write down. And sometimes all you can offer is an open gate, a slow hand, and a name that fits. If this story nudged anything brave in you, tap like, share it with a friend who thinks broken means finished, and subscribe so you don't miss the next time an unwanted horse decides to show a small town what it's for. And if you happen to pass by a dusty yard where the numbers are moving faster than the hearts, maybe raise your hand for something that isn't practical. By the miles, the miracles will meet you at the fence.